Welcome to session 4 of EDSE 457. This is Dr. Keisler, and this session will be covering chapters 5, 6, and 7 in your textbook. So we'll be considering a lot of the factors and strategies that go into covering reading comprehension in particular. So we're going to talk a little bit about planning for instruction, activating students' prior knowledge, guiding their reading comprehension, and overall our before, during, and after considerations for planning instruction during reading. So one of the key concepts or questions that you want to keep in mind throughout this session is, how do I guide students' reading of text in meaningful ways? So this is really the question that should influence the planning and the selection of strategies that you use when planning for reading in the content areas. So let's first do a little review of some previous chapters and talk about the idea of content literacy or disciplinary literacy. So when we refer to content literacy, right, because we've got two, when you consider what makes somebody literate, you have the actual skills of reading, but then we have this second layer that we refer to as content literacy when you're talking about what makes somebody literate in their content areas. So what is that? So it's developing the ability to think, to read, to write, to speak, and to view in the content areas or the disciplines, right? So we can also refer to different content areas as the disciplines. So the question that you want to answer or help your students answer is, can they think, read, write, and speak like a scientist, like a mathematician, like a historian, like an artist, etc.? Each discipline has language and structure of language that is unique to it. So scientists and historians don't necessarily know the same content or use the same type of vocabulary, put sentences together in the same way, structure text in the same way. And so each particular discipline has these features unique to it. So in terms of then content area reading and writing. Content area reading and writing then focus on imparting reading and study skills that help students better understand and remember what they read. So we've got two jobs as content area teachers. The first is to have our students become content literate, right? So we want them to know the language of science or math or history or art or whatever it is that I teach. So we want them to be able to know the language and the content that is specific to that discipline. But then we also need them to have reading and study skills that are going to help them access that content. So we touched on that idea in our first session, and it's going to be a recurring theme throughout this course. So then content versus process. You read about this, and the content is essentially the what you are teaching, and the process is the how you will teach it. And so another big idea that you should keep in mind when doing any instructional planning is the idea that content determines process. So what you're going to teach will be determines how you will teach it. So you need to consider then how, in terms of content literacy, how reading and writing is used in your content area, right? So you want to select strategies and implement processes that support students in using reading and writing to learn, right? So you think about what it is that you have to teach, and then you think about what that demands in terms of literacy from your students, and then that helps you select the right strategies for helping them access that content. All right, so there are some factors then that influence content literacy, right? So when we're talking about how students will learn to read, write, think, speak, and view like a scientist, mathematician, historian, etc. So the factors that influence, some of the factors that influence that are, let's say, the learner's prior knowledge of, attitude toward, and interest in the subject. So let's take science for an example. So how much background knowledge I bring to the science task or the science text is going to influence how much I take out of it. How I feel about science in general, or how I feel about myself and my ability to learn the science material, so my efficacy for learning science, and then how much I'm interested in it, right? So those are things that are going to influence how much of that content I can access. And it's important to know that these are all also things that can be manipulated by the teacher, right? So if you know how much prior knowledge students bring to a task, and you know that it's not much, you can try to fill that in before you have students approach the task. You can kind of get an idea, or you could actually survey students to find out how they feel about learning your content, and then you can work towards, if they're not receptive to it, making them more receptive, or changing the way they feel about themselves as a learner of science or a learner of art or a learner of math by giving them the opportunity to be successful in the content area. And then interest, right? You can do multiple things to pique students' interest in your subject matter. So then there's the learner's purpose for engaging in the reading, the writing, and the discussion. So the way or the purpose that students have either set for themselves or you set for them influences how they're going to engage with your content. And a lot of those strategies revolve around reading, writing, and discussing. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about those in depth after this. Obviously, the language and the conceptual difficulty of the text material. So how difficult the concepts are that they're going to learn and to engage with are going to influence how much they learn, and then how complex that language is. So when we think back again to the language of a scientist, mathematician, historian, artist, etc., how much that language is unfamiliar, familiar to them, and how difficult in general it is for them to understand, not just individual words and vocabulary, but how sentences are put together. Is going to influence how much they take away or how much they learn. So then the assumptions that the text writers make about their audience of readers. So this is super important in the content areas. I'm sure that you've noticed sometimes you probably encounter text that assumes you are bringing a lot of prior knowledge to the subject. And so how much, the assumption that you're bringing a certain amount of prior knowledge influences how that author wrote the text. So just kind of an example, let's say from language arts, I remember in college I read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, right? So I did personally not take a lot from that text because I did not have a lot of background knowledge that I needed about living in Russia at the time that novel was written. And so that novel is kind of written with the assumption that the reader is going to kind of understand the history, the culture, the society at that time. And if you don't bring that with you, that's going to influence kind of how you understand and interpret that particular text. Assumptions come into play also pretty significantly when you're approaching not just literature, but social studies text, right? So a lot of history and social studies is written with the assumption that the readers or the audience bring with them is a significant amount of background knowledge on whatever the subject is. And so when students don't bring that, that's going to influence kind of how they can interpret and how they can learn about that text. So in general, the more background knowledge you need to bring, you can assume that that text is going to be more difficult for students to get through, or that topic or that content area is going to be more difficult for you to bring students through. The text structures that writers use to organize their ideas and information. So this is kind of how complex the text is, how long the sentences are, do they use graphics, do they use visuals, do they use a lot of figurative language, do they use sophisticated grammar and punctuation. So the way that students can read the text in terms of how it is structured influences how much they can take from that. And then lastly, the teacher's beliefs about and attitudes towards the use of text in the learning situations. So um, what you sometimes find is that teachers make two assumptions or have two beliefs, that either the text is too difficult, and so what you tend to find is that teachers don't actually allow students to have a lot of meaningful interactions with the text, but rather the teachers pull all of the content and all of the meaning out of the text and then present it to the student. So the teacher is actually doing all of, what I term the heavy lifting in terms of going in, thinking, pulling out the important material, and then sharing it with the students, which is great for students to learn the actual content, but it doesn't help students learn to be content literate. So it doesn't help them learn to read, write, think, speak, and view like a scientist, a mathematician, a historian, any of those disciplines, because they don't actually interact with the text or the writing themselves. And so they may learn the content, but they won't necessarily be able to do this independently. Then the second assumption would be that this is just the text, and even if it's difficult, students need to learn to do it themselves, and so teachers have students engage with and interact with text that is far too difficult and far too complex for them, and do not provide the appropriate scaffolds and strategies for students. And so the outcome is the same as the first example, in that students can't independently and strategically attack that text and take out the information that they need. All right, so let's talk a little bit then about, when we talk about interacting with text, we talk about what a reader does. Essentially, these are the four things that a reader can do, right? So they can decode words, they can read fluently, which means they can read aloud effectively, and then that translates to silent reading, so they can read that text kind of without interruption and without having to sound out too many words. They're able to activate their vocabulary knowledge as they read, and they use comprehension strategies. So some of the think about yourself, when you read. So you monitor your own comprehension. Likely, whatever you read, as you read, when you encounter something that you don't understand or you don't know, what is it that you do? Generally, you stop, you reread kind of that sentence, and you say, do I understand it? No. Oftentimes, you'll ask yourself a question, right? So like, what is it that I didn't understand, or what are they trying to explain to me, or what does this mean? So you ask questions of yourself, and then you go back up and you scan the text, or you go down and you scan the text to see if you can answer your own questions. As you read, if you're a effective and successful reader, which most of you probably are, you make predictions about what you're going to read next. Sometimes you'll find yourself saying, I already know what's going to happen next, right? Or I already know what the text is going to tell me next. So you kind of skip over pieces of the text. You make assumptions about what words mean when you don't know them. So when you come across a word that you don't know, you kind of go back over it, you look at the word parts, you make approximations. So you say, well, I don't really know what this word means, but it looks like or sounds like this word that I do know. So if I plug in that meaning, does the sentence make sense? And okay. So I kind of get an idea of what that word means. So these are the type of comprehension strategies that good readers use. Some of these strategies need to be taught to students explicitly. So particularly if we have students who are not very successful or effective readers. So like I just explained to you, these are the things that good readers do, right? They're active readers, which means they're thinking as they read, and they're doing those things like asking themselves questions. They're reading for purpose, so they understand why they're reading the text and what they're trying to get out of it. They're evaluative, so they're constantly evaluating that text, seeing if they understand what it means. They're thoughtful. They pause as they read. They think about it. They make connections to other things that they know or other things that they've read. They're strategic, which means when they don't understand what they're doing, they have those strategies to employ. They go back and ask questions. They go back and confirm predictions. They think about the words that they don't know. They're persistent. So they go and They continue reading a text even when they find the subject matter difficult, and then they're productive, which means they understand at the end. So I'm actually at the end of my 15-minute time limit for the screencast, so I'm going to stop us here and pick up on screencast 2.